Hello, Melbourne, Australia. This is Athens calling. I'm Yannis Varoufakis. It's been a couple of years since I was with you down under and in your splendid building. I believe now you have a new building. I hope that it proves to be a wonderful new home for the community. As you know, Greece is in the clasps of a very serious and quite debilitating in many ways negotiation with our partners in Europe, but primarily with the so-called Troika of institutions, the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the Commission. For 5 years now, this Troika has been implementing, in the context of a huge loan agreement, a so-called reform package for the Greek economy that has proven quite catastrophic, actually. I mean, in the history of economic policy, is going to go down as a major disaster. Think about it. The Greek state in 2010 lost its capacity to service its debts. In everyday language, it went bankrupt, to the extent that the state can go bankrupt. States don't go bankrupt like businesses. They don't pull down the shutters, but they simply lose their capacity to refinance their debts. And then there are enormous problems paying pensions and salaries and meeting the state's debts and so on and so forth. So we had a case of insolvency. Unfortunately, the powers that be, both here in Athens and elsewhere, decided that the way to deal with this bankruptcy is to extend a huge loan, the largest loan in history, on conditions of very severe austerity that essentially reduced income by a quarter, overall national income, GDP as it's called. So you only need to be a 10-year-old to understand that this cannot end well when you add debt to debt, pretending that what is really an insolvency problem is a problem of illiquidity, and you get the new borrowing, the new debt on board on condition of shrinking your income. In view of the fact that the income that you had initially was not enough to service your debt, you can understand that what you're talking about is a complete disaster. So this extend and pretend, which was only done for a very simple reason, in order to make sure that the bankers that had lent to the Greek state prior to 2010 didn't lose a penny, and they didn't. And all these losses are transferred from the private sector, from the banking system of Europe, Northern Europe, and to some extent the Greek banks. These losses were transferred onto the shoulders of the Greek taxpayers initially, and then this cost, this burden, would spread out to the rest of Europe, as the Greek taxpayers simply would not be able to take this burden, to hold it. So for 5 years, a bad thing has been made worse. So-called reforms were attacking the little people. There was no real reforms. All we had was reductions, a sequence of reductions in pensions, in salaries, in benefits, and increase in taxes. This was a never-ending cycle of doom. And the only reason why we were elected was because the Greek people had enough of that. So we were elected with a mandate to renegotiate this deal on a very basic principle, that it wasn't in the end even good for our creditors, because our capacity to repay our debts was being severely circumscribed by this never-ending cycle. In the end, if you have a sick cow and you keep beating it, you're not going to produce more milk. It will get sicker, and in the end, it will stop producing any milk. That's a very simple logic. The problem, of course, is that our fellow European governments find it very hard to come to terms with reality. And the reason why they find it hard is because now they have to go to their people and to their parliaments and admit to what they did in the past, which is to mislead them, to tell them that these loans were loans to the Greek people. They never were loans to the Greek people. They were bailouts of the banks. And they have to come clean. And no politician wants to come clean about such a major misleading act of misleading parliaments and peoples. So we are caught in between a reality that needs to be addressed and the politics of Northern Europe in particular, and of the IMF, which is utterly inimical and resistant to the truth. Our government was not, however, elected in order to continue the lie, especially when the continuation of this lie is not only unsustainable, you need to carry on borrowing more and more, so it is a kind of Ponzi scheme, except that instead of having Ponzi growth, we have the very curious phenomenon of having Ponzi austerity. So not only is it not sustainable, but it is also catastrophic for the Greek people, and not very good for Europe, actually, right? So we're struggling to convince them that reality has to take precedence over political expediency. And we're alone, because there are two kinds of governments in Europe at the moment, or actually three kinds of governments in Europe at the moment. There are those who have led this process of the fake bailouts, and they really do not want to admit to the error of their ways, especially to their own people. There are the other governments that in the periphery of Europe, I shan't mention which ones, you can imagine which I'm referring to, that went through a similar crisis to ours, and those governments implemented this austerity and caused a lot of suffering amongst their people. So they have, of course, a vested interest in our failure, because if we succeed, then suddenly they will have to be answerable to their own people as to why they didn't do what we did. And then thirdly, there are other governments that haven't had yet to implement the kind of austerity that was forced upon us, who fear that they may have to, that this kind of ill wind will be blowing their way. And yet, at the same time, they are too coy. So they would like us to succeed, but they are too coy to speak out in case they are branded as sympathizers of us and find themselves on the receiving end of much wrath. So, this is where we are. We have to come to an agreement, and at the same time, we can't afford simply to agree to anything that they give us. The negotiation is very tough. Our people are continuing to suffer. This government is facing essentially a coup d'etat, not using the tanks as they did in 1967, as the powers that be in 1967, but using the banks. This is the main means by which we're being squeezed. But we're not going to succumb. We are going to continue to speak truth to power, and we're going to continue to negotiate, seeking an honorable agreement. We're going to compromise, make lots of compromises, but we're not going to be compromised, as I like to say. Your support in events like tonight's is of the utmost importance to us, psychologically, tangibly, in practical terms, in every which way. I wish to thank you from Athens and send you my solidarity for the solidarity that you're extending to us. Και τώρα μερικές κουβέντες στα ελληνικά. Από καρδίας σας στέλνω και σας στέλνουμε όλοι μου οι συνεργάτες, ο Αλέξης Τσίπρας, η υπόλοιπη διαπραγματευτική ομάδα, το Υπουργικό Συμβούλιο, όλο το Ελληνικό Κοινοβούλιο, θα έλεγα. Σας στέλνουμε τις ευχαριστίες μας και την αγάπη μας και την αλληλεγγύη μας για την αλληλεγγύη που μας προσφέρετε σε αυτές τις δύσκολες στιγμές. Θέλω να ξέρετε ότι αυτό δεν έχει καμία απολύτως σχέση με τα κομματικά. Περπατάω στους δρόμους της Αθήνας, εδώ έξω στις πλατείες Συντάγματος, και έρχονται άνθρωποι, συμπολίτες μας από όλα τα κόμματα, ανεξάρτητα από το τι έχουν ψηφίσει, και μας προσφέρουν τη συμπαράστασή τους, γιατί καταλαβαίνουν ότι αυτό το οποίο γίνεται τώρα, σε αυτή τη διαπραγμάτευση, είναι ένα εθνικό μέτωπο εναντίον του ψεύδους, της αυτοτροφοδοτούμενης κρίσης, της αυτοϋπονόμευσης που πετυχαίνει μια λιτότητα σε περίοδο μεγάλης κρίσης. Και η δική σας συμπαράσταση, να ξέρετε ότι και αυτή δεν έχει κομματικές ταμπέλες και επιγραφές. Την βλέπουμε σαν μια εθνική προσπάθεια, η οποία ξεπερνάει τα όρια της Ελλάδας και γεφυρώνει την Ελλάδα με την Αυστραλία. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ και ελπίζω να σας δω σύντομα στη Μελβούρνη.